A few weeks ago, I was pretty bored, so I found myself endlessly scrolling on my favorite science fiction forum on Facebook. I moved past a number of what-if topics, as is the nature of science fiction forums, and I settled on the topic of transhumanism. On the forum, cultural discussions were generally not encouraged, so it was fairly surprising to me to see a controversial and heated topic on an otherwise apolitical forum. This Facebook tiff, on a science fiction forum, the sort of place that's supposed to be a techno-progressive hub, got me thinking, why is transhumanism so hated? If you were to type in transhumanism into the YouTube search box, you'd get all sorts of crazy shit. Few results on human augmentation fall outside of conspiracy theories or moral panic. If you were going by the common opinion on the internet, you'd think that any sort of human augmentation was the mark of the beast, or the sign of the Christian end times, or some dark government science. Perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself. What exactly is transhumanism? Quote, the belief that the human race can and should evolve beyond its current physical and mental limitations by means of science and technology. In a 1957 paper, Julian Huxley wrote, up till now, human life has generally been, as Hobbes described it, nasty, brutish, and short. The great majority of human beings, if they had not already died young, have been afflicted with misery. We can justifiably hold the belief that these lands of possibility exist, and that the present limitations and miserable frustrations of our existence could be in large measure surmounted. The human species can, if it wishes, transcend itself, not just sporadically, an individual here in one way, an individual there in another way, but in its entirety as humanity. Now that you've got a definition, you can probably think of a book that you've read, a game that you've played, or a movie that you've watched that has some sort of transhumanist theme. Despite the pervasiveness of these themes, transhumanism or techno-progressivism in general has failed to gain any sort of political or cultural traction, and we just don't know why. By we, I mean transhumanists. I'm assuming that you are into technology and cyborgs and stuff. It's a fair assumption. You're here, right? This is especially apparent when compared to other movements of the 21st century. Why is transhumanism so unpersuasive? And how can Bloodborne answer this? From the outset of Bloodborne, it's easy to see that something has gone terribly wrong. Werewolves and wolfmen roam the streets of the city you wake up in. The clergy and governing body have turned into elk demons, and most of the people tasked with hunting these creatures have lost their mind or turned themselves. The Healing Church is the first organization you find in Bloodborne, and they bear a lot of responsibility for what has gone on in Yharnam. To make a lot of the lore short, the predecessors of the church found an abandoned Lovecraftian god in ancient tombs, and used its blood to heal diseases and grant superhuman abilities. Control and distribution of this blood made the Healing Church incredibly powerful. It's suggested that they operate as a religious institution, corporation, research group, and de facto rulers of Yharnam. When they discovered that the blood they distributed turned people into monsters, they created death squads under the guise of healers, doctors, and hunters to keep the tide of beasts at bay. The secondary function of these enforcers were to kill those who asked too many questions. The other related organizations of Bloodborne are also equally, if not more, immoral. It doesn't take an astute ethicist to figure out that the organizations of Bloodborne are unethical, like sacrifice an entire city to achieve godhood unethical. Much of the language used by intellectuals of Bloodborne is a direct reference to real-world 20th century eugenicists. For example, let's play a game of Who Said This? Evolution without courage will be the ruin of our race. The psychological impact of 20th century bad science cannot be understated. Much of the modern American conspiracy theories revolve around secret government experiments on the population. The anti-vaccinations and anti-GMO movements are great examples. They're predicated on the idea that the inventors and distributors of this technology are either nefarious or neglectful. Suspicion of family planning, reproductive technology, genetic alteration, and chip implants also have their roots in the ethical misdeeds of researchers in the 20th century. In pre-World War II Europe and North America, eugenics was a fad amongst some academics and progressives. Canada to Sweden and many countries in between, thousands of people were sterilized and experimented on. The subjects of sterilization were often Aboriginal peoples of the United States and Canada, women deemed to have too large of a sexual drive, as in the case Buck versus Bell, epileptics, and others deemed as defective. This was the era where Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. said, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." By the end of the eugenics movement in the United States, roughly 65,000 women alone were sterilized. While the early 19th century's eugenics is terrible, it's relatively obscure. It's the 20th century's eugenics that solidified the fear of human augmentation. The Japanese Empire had an infamous biological and chemical weapons concentration camp, Unit 731. There, 3,000 people, mostly Chinese civilians, were experimented on. The United States didn't try the researchers at the camp for crimes against humanity in exchange for information to develop chemical and biological weapon systems. Civilian accounts of what happened there were dismissed by the United States as communist propaganda. The German Nazis had their own group of horrible human science experiments, the most infamous case being the work of Joseph Mengele. If you didn't know, the Nazis didn't just break up races into white, black, Asian, etc. They believed that the Slavic peoples, Britons, French, and Mediterranean Europeans were distinct races as well. Along with the Jewish and Roma peoples, the Nazis hated Slavic peoples, and had a plan to depopulate Poland, European Russia, and Ukraine. The Nazis turned eugenic thought on Europeans themselves. In the aftermath of World War II, various countries that had eugenics activists quietly disbanded. Some countries that sterilized people didn't acknowledge their involvement in the eugenics movement until the 1990s. Of course, since it was the 20th century, the craziness didn't end. The United States in particular had a couple of infamous experiments. MKUltra from 1953 to 1973. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment from 1932 to 1972. The contraceptive trials in Puerto Rico. I don't really want to get into the specific fucked upness of each experiment, so I've linked the details and videos and source material in the description below. But to give you an idea of just how bad some of these experiments were, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment lasted for 40 years on the population of black men in rural Alabama to study the long-term effects of syphilis. Even after the invention of penicillin in 1940, the subjects of the study were actively prevented from receiving treatment or were provided placebo medications. James H. Jones, in his book Bad Blood, said, quote, "This was the longest non-therapeutic experiment on human beings in medical history." End quote. Quote, "For the most part, doctors and civil servants simply did their jobs. Some merely followed orders. Others worked for the glory of science." End quote. John R. Heller Jr. Many recoil when they hear talk about the betterment of the human species through technology. Unless you go through the ideas with a fine comb, negative eugenics, positive eugenics, and transhumanism seem like the same thing. This confusion about what eugenics is and what transhumanism is a major issue that transhumanists face in convincing people that they don't want to cause harm. The horror of Bloodborne relies on a strong disgust response. Body parts being morphed and warped to achieve an inhuman state gives the game its constant, unsettling atmosphere. It's the same disgust response that some feel when they hear about people that implant machinery into their skin, or inject themselves with DNA on a live stream. For example, how does the idea of someone cutting off an arm and replacing it with a bionic one sit with you? Of course, the uncanny valley, the body horror that you may experience when you see someone with a bionic arm or glowing implant may just be caused by the fact that the technology isn't streamlined yet. Our augmentation today is still quite rudimentary, and comes with multitudes of drawbacks. Nootropics often have a cascade of side effects, or minimal impact. Genetic alteration can lead to cancer. Implants have to contend with the difficult-to-control immune response. Building a super-intelligent artificial system seems easier than augmenting an existing biological organism. Many with religious or spiritual inclinations see this as a natural order enforcing itself. Alter what is at your own peril. The characters of Bloodborne learned what happened when you go full augmentation without beta testing your technology. Aside from the direct cover-ups from the organizations of the game, the many great ones seem intent on screwing with humanity or using them as pawns in a bigger game. These inhuman great ones, these gods, represent a barrier of entry for humans trying to ascend into godhood. What does the true ending of Bloodborne say about humanity and their place in the cosmos? Most, if not all, far future science fiction has humans in it. Star Wars, Star Trek, Doctor Who, each has a human or humanoid creatures in it with the same limitations and vices we have. It's not dissimilar to human mythologies with flawed gods inhabiting its stories. While one can imagine a superhuman that can run faster, punch through walls, and see in the ultraviolet and infrared spectrum, one cannot easily comprehend something as alien as a post-human several times removed from what we are today. Melding one's mind with a Jupiter brain or becoming an eldritch demigod is so far outside the human experience that there's nothing truly intelligent that anyone can say about its experience or motives. Humans want a future with us in it. More specifically, humans want a future with us at the center of the narrative. We know that our bodies didn't evolve for the rigors of living in outer space. We know that the theoretical upper limits of computational power far outclass human cognition. We know that a species capable of moving from star to star can have a biological, if such a term is applicable, capabilities that would make our medical technology seem like prehistoric herbal remedies. Yet our pop sci-fi stories and mythologies are quite terrestrial. In the ending of Bloodborne, the player character becomes an infant great one. It's a conclusion that is dejecting and unsatisfying for many. The story of Bloodborne at this point must end, as anything that could be said after the true ending is far outside of our comprehension. Faced with unknown experience and computational ability, humans tend to fill the void with the worst possible scenarios. This, no doubt, is the result of evolving during a time where the unknown could mean your doom. It's a survival mechanism that transhumanists have failed to address, since they, also being human, have no insight as to what post-humanity would be like. Transhumanists appear to some like mad scholars in a Lovecraftian tale. Describing what we would become in a post-human world is as effective as your pet making an attempt at differential calculus. And while that is exciting to the transhumanist, it doesn't allow one to create a narrative that many people can get on board with. Transhumanism, in practice, is the act of having a two-dimensional map to figure out how to live in this world, and marking a location on an inanimate object several paces away from the map and saying, "We should go there."